successful in our first republic that the Americans enjoyed the finest of economic times, while the rest of the industrialized world was long in the Great Depression. The left hand, the President Roosevelt, which are institutions, and it is still foreign to us this very day. We have yet to recover. 45 years later, the IRA and internal governments among our initiative introduce efforts to reestablishing the sovereignty focused on the oldest profession of American Indians. That's gambling. Bingo and other gaming operations has been without exception proven initial success. Failure through mismanagement, politics, or litigation has been less than 15%, showing a better than 85% success rate. The new Indian-sponsored gaming industry collapsed success ratios of any industry in America. Gaming operations are proven to benefit the revenue of communities, many counties, state, or Indian reservation. The regulation of bingo and gaming as long as they are experiencing repetition of issue. One such remedy is success. Results. The United States government, through Congress, once again intervenes to regulate proven success in violation of all basic economics and totally contrary to the law. American Indians are human beings. We are supposed to be citizens of the United States of America. We fought new wars in other countries. Our Navajo Nation co-op preserved and saved this nation. We have the unalienable right to talk, better, and prove the truth as long as we do not harm or inform of anyone. There is no piece of evidence anywhere that proves Indians ever conspired to establish bingo. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, the infamous colonial office of the Department of Interior, and the initiator of slaves and bondmen, has been regulating contracts on Indian reservations since 1824. This fact alone should convince and teach every student of government that regulation of commerce and enterprise does not work. In fact, it only produces the opposite result. Graft and corruption is rampant because the contracting interests of the BLA and Chinese tribal government. Indian front contractors bid for and received by subcontractors only to proceed to build shoddy, dangerous bridges, schools, roads, and dams. The Indians just we've always been running to it. Contracting and regulations are still between feet process within the BLA, now traffic laws. Within the past 2 years, I've attempted to assist 7 Indian reservations located in the southwest process. The experts I represent were from various groups interested in establishing states, ourselves, Indian enterprise, factories, fishing ports, and international trade. I now know that tribal governments do not want and control the people. That is why, as a major contributor, the BLA is a major player in the alliance has been sold by many bureaucrats for its meager funds as $40. There is a scandal in Russia's relationship with the I challenge this investigations committee to intricately go into the branches of royalty and land operations. The BIA does not enforce its just responsibility by its country. In September of 1987, from the first county in America, Pine Ridge,
Hello, greetings. Welcome on this Sunday. Welcome to everybody. We hope everybody is really doing well with maintaining your mental, physical, and spiritual health on every level as much as is humanly possible. And we are very happy and excited that you decided to join us today for this critical topic that we're going to be discussing for the next hour. Thankstaking and American identity. As we always do, we want to start by acknowledging, which we're going to be doing for this whole hour, but the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. The clip that was on leading up to the start time was Russell Means, who was one of the leading organizers for the American Indian movement. And since we just commemorated the day of his physical transition earlier this week, we just wanted to have him there. I understand because there's all these copyright laws that these capitalists have. You may not have been able to hear him because Facebook won't always transmit those types of presentations. So apologize for that, but it's important that we know that these struggles have always taken place and they're not anything new. So we start by acknowledging the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, the rightful caretakers of all of these lands from Alaska down through Chile. And we've just seen the controversy of settler colonialism in Canada this week with the First Nations groups up there sabotaging their fishing environment and their right to self-determination. And this has been the strategy against the indigenous people for 500 plus years. And what you're seeing happening in Canada, we should relate that to the fact that capitalism and these empires, these capitalist empires, are dependent upon controlling land. That's how capitalism evolved. That's how it developed. That's how it maintains itself, controlling land and resources. And so obviously that means in order for them to do that, they have to prohibit the indigenous people from having access to their natural land. So what you've seen, happening in Canada is another manifestation of that. And so that's why, we want to tackle this subject today from the standpoint of November is approaching. And so you have the annual propaganda, so-called holiday, Thankstaking, which sole purpose is to propagate the concept that this country in its present form exists in a legal and legitimate entity, when in fact it doesn't. It's a criminal empire that was founded on theft and murder. And so we'll be talking about that the next hour, along with the fact that this question of being an American, these concepts of white supremacy and the theft of indigenous land, the enslavement of African people, and this concept of being an American, and how it's very difficult to convince us that you can be an American and be against white supremacy. So we just really want to, have that discussion with you today. Sorry, a little distracted. They've been gone for a couple of weeks, but the white supremacists are back. So just got distracted blocking them out. But that's what we're going to talk about. And then also, we always want to acknowledge our African ancestors who struggled resolutely for us to be here today. And again, we pound and pound and pound this ridiculous notion floating around here by people who haven't studied a single page of history, of African history, and instead take their consciousness from the very people who oppress and exploit us, and come out with this backward concept. Well, I'm not my ancestors. I'm not my grandmother. This is a different generation. This is not that's absurdity talking for anybody that believes that. Our people have struggled against our oppression since day one, since it started, and continue to do that. And the fact that we're here today is clear proof of that, because if they would have so meekly set aside any resistance, as some of these people would have you believe, then there's no way that we would even be here today. The fact that we're here is a manifestation of that tremendous struggle. And a lot of these people, again, devoid of history, know nothing, can talk to you, because I've talked to these people, and they can say nothing about the massive slave raid resistance in the Bakongo region of West Africa that occurred for 300 years, you all, where the central coast of Africa was a hotbed of slave resistance. And the Qualimbos that exist in Brazil, which were nothing more than Africans kidnapped from Africa, taken to the Caribbean and South America, uniting with indigenous people to resist the colonizers. So anybody that is naive and ignorant enough to say, well, I'm not my ancestor. I mean, that's just about the dumbest thing you can say. So stop saying that. If you're listening and you're saying that, stop saying that. You don't know what you're talking about. And you sound silly talking that way and very disrespectful. You know, our ancestors fought resistance. What have you done to fight against resistance? Who have you fought, confronted and challenged that's oppressing us? So you have no right to speak that way about our ancestors. We respect and love our ancestors. So with that, we will go ahead and get this started. As always, we do quick introductions. My name is Ajamu, organizer for the All African People's Revolutionary Party on 3 continents in the Caribbean, done work and will continue to do that while I exist. And joining me, as always, every week is my amazing daughter, Shakura, who has grown up through the All African People's Revolutionary Party's Young Pioneer Institute program and is now completing her studies and continuing her activist work, organizing our people for liberation. And I'm honored to do this with her every week and appreciate all the work that she's doing to advance our struggle. And then getting back to the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the organization that sponsors these seminars every week, we have an objective in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. It's called Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa. One unified socialist Africa. As Kwame Nkrumah, the author of the book you see there, The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, stated clearly in 1968, until Africa is the center of the Black Revolution. And all Black revolutionaries around the world have to come to understand the importance and the primacy of Africa. Until Africa is free, no African anywhere on earth will be free. So we see Pan-Africanism as the highest expression of Black power, the highest expression of Black power. And we see Pan-Africanism as our contribution to the worldwide socialist movement leading to world communism. That's who we are. And we unite we have chapters all over the world, all throughout Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, Canada, and the United Snakes of America. And we also do quite a bit of work with other national liberation groups, including obviously the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. So on that note, I will turn it over to Shakura to get us started.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As my dad said, I hope you all continue to remain as safe and well as you can be with all the mayhem and chaos that is going on. I also just want to acknowledge that as the weather is changing and things are starting to become more and more gloomy for some of us, I'm hoping that we're all finding ways to take care of ourselves, our loved ones, and even people that we live around as best as we can, because not only is the weather impacting how I feel personally, but also just this ongoing concept of quarantine and how dangerous that can be for us emotionally, our mental health, as well as our physical health, right? So I hope that if it's eating lunch, or if it's taking a nap, or if it's taking a walk outside, or maybe you remember that you need to put gas in your car, whatever your thing is that makes you happy, I hope that you can find some type of way to do that each week so that you can have something to look forward to as you practice self-care. Okay, and on that note, I will go ahead and jump into the notes for today. So Kwame Ture said it often, there is such an absence of understanding within the US that most people can tell you absolutely nothing about the Americas before 1492. In fact, not only do they know nothing about America before 1492, their arrogance makes it so they don't even want to know. In 1492, Cristobal Colon, better known as Christopher Columbus, led a ragtag group of scurvy, syphilis-carrying terrorist pirates into the Caribbean area known today as the Dominican Republic. Lost, hungry, diseased, and on the edge of death, these terrorists were greeted with integrity by the Arawak people in that region, and thus the last 528 years of terror began. By begin, we mean the establishment of the colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere. The institutionalization of systemic theft of indigenous lands and the establishment of the chattel slavery system of kidnapping, violence, and terror that forcibly brought Africans here from Africa to build up this capitalist empire. Whites and everyone else were not left out. The myth of white supremacy was created from this carnage to serve as a historical justification for the barbarianism that started in 1492 and continues to this day. What capitalist history will never tell you is the consistencies that the indigenous and African people stood up this violent onslaught. For the indigenous people from Alaska down to Chile and everywhere in between, from the Arawaks in 1492 to the descendants of Aztecs, Mayans, Incas, and Plains indigenous people today, their resistance has been consistent and uncompromising. For the African masses, from the first kidnappers who violated our people in Eritrea, Somalia, kidnapping the Maasai, Fulani, etc., dragging them across the African continent to continue to terrorize the Wolof, Mandinka, Malinde, Fante, Bakongo, etc., our people fought them relentlessly for our freedom. In fact, the only logical reason that explains why millions of Africans today exist throughout every corner of the Americas is that our people fought for our survival through tremendous sacrifices. It's this glorious struggle of resistance that we have to learn how to embrace, respect, and pass on to our future generations. The challenge we have in doing this is the capitalist system built and dependent on our collective oppression in order to continue to exist must ensure that its distorted, dishonest, and criminal version of history remains dominant. To help in their process, they continue to institutionalize imperialist concepts like the so-called Thankstaking holiday in November to continue to propagandize you to believe that country was divided up in peace, and that makes it every bit as much yours as anyone else's. This is such a smooth and efficient process of misinformation that many of you actually believe that you can call yourselves Americans and still stand for justice. Many of you see absolutely no contradiction with this reality. Next slide, please. The Thankstaking holiday in reality is a commemoration of the 1637 systemic murder of the Pequot people of Virginia, US. Relying on the individualistic ideological framework, they have conditioned everyone to accept as whole and complete truth the capitalist system bets on most of us arrogantly believing that our understanding on these issues is complete just based on whatever it is we think we know right now. As a result, what we end up with is millions of people who actually believe you can take a day designated and propagated for hundreds of years to have a specific meaning, and without doing anything appreciably different, from how that day was designed, you can practice something that somehow means something else. In other words, millions of people today will tell you with a straight face, and I've had people tell me this, that they weren't celebrating Thankstaking, although they carry out the activities designed to celebrate Thankstaking. They sit around the table, watch sports with all the capitalist propaganda sprinkled in all day, basically, eat the menu provided to you by the imperialism for the day, but you aren't celebrating it. This is the type of individualistic logic that permits European people to argue confidently that they cannot be racist because they have colonized children. Or another example of the individualistic logic, men to argue that they cannot abuse women because they are in relationships with them and they have daughters and mothers. And before I close out my time, I would just say that the AAPRP has continued to instill these values in me. So not only do I take them with me and I think about them everywhere and in everything that I do, but I also try to share these examples and these reasonings with other people that I interact with, because I feel like it's my responsibility to help pass on this knowledge so that we really can create a global understanding that this is not a holiday we want to celebrate. And so what I mean is, last November, as many of you know, I teach at the university here, and a couple of my students were leaving to start their un-Thanksgiving break, and they said, bye, Masumi. And I said, okay, be safe. I'm not going to say happy so-and-so because I don't celebrate it, but I do want you to be safe. So I said, have a safe time and, get some rest. I'll see you when we come back. You're not going to wish me a happy. And so then I went into it and I said, I'm not going to stand here and waste too much of your time because I know you're ready to go. But if you're interested, I can send you some articles, because with me and my pedagogy, it's all about backing it up with evidence, right? I could talk to you till we're blue in the face, but you need to see that other people have actually published work on how inhumane this holiday actually is and how ludicrous it is for us to actually celebrate it. So one student in particular was very interested and emailed me and asked for the article. And I just feel like that's a prime example of how not only was she completely clueless about how oppressed Indigenous people are, she had no idea that that's really what the holiday was all about. No one had ever had that conversation with her. And I felt like that was a great opportunity for her to grow as a human being because she was interested in gaining that knowledge. And so I just continue to pass that on, and I encourage all of us to always be hungry for finding information and then finding a way to share it with other people so that we can discuss it and be critical about what it is that we understand it to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shakur. And that last part, about people not really being aware of it, I think that's something that we have to talk a lot more about, because I think the assumption people have is that people generally understand that, this land is Indigenous people's land, and that's a contradiction. But I wouldn't argue that. I would argue that a lot of people today, because there's so much misinformation out here, do not necessarily have a clear understanding of what's happened historically in these lands. And so, people, for the most part, do things through rote, just through reaction, or as Kwame Ture said, people don't think, they think they're thinking, but in reality, they're reacting to stimuli. And I do think that that's how the majority of people move, just reacting to stimuli. And so, it's people sit up and do all the manifestations of the so-called holiday and will tell you they're not celebrating. I mean, look at that meat there. It's been decades. It's been a long time since I've had anything like that. But that doesn't even look, that looks nasty. But pretty much there's some people who cook something else. But for the most part, this is the standard fare. And it's like, that's not even appetizing. And it's just because that's been what's been ingrained in us to do it that way. But I think, like Shakur was talking about, it's so important for us to recognize that this felony crime is still in progress today. It's never stopped being in progress. It still continues, right? And these vicious assaults against Indigenous people have been occurring for going on 530 years to steal this land. And whether it happens in the historical sense, which we'll talk about in a quick second, or whether it happens today through the land grab process, better described as gentrification, it's still the same process of theft of land It's still the exact same process. And the reason why we say that is if you look at, and I've been able to do a lot of housing justice work over the years. And from doing that work, what I've learned, even if you look at today, because you might say, well, people moving into a place in somewhere like Oakland, California, for example, they're just trying to find somewhere to live. They don't know anything about the history there. A lot of them moving there, like they don't even know that that's traditionally a city of colonized people. And that's true. But the reality of the process is what we're talking about, that the way so-called gentrification happens is through an alliance between government forces, which are funded by our tax dollars, like building commissions, city commissions, who have endowment funds and have tax revenue that they use and work with private developers to create these. And we talked about this, and we talked a couple of weeks ago about one of the other topics about how they'll go into a neighborhood and they'll talk about there's a gang problem. And once they do that, if you know anything about the real estate market, once that takes hold, the property values are going to drop tremendously. And once they drop, then the developers can swoop in and buy up the property, invest very little in it, and build up something like what you see in the bottom picture, and then sell it or rent it out at exorbitant prices, as now the neighborhood has suddenly become attractive to all these people who would have never set foot in it when they had the gang reputation. So this is just the newest format of theft of indigenous land. That's what that is. So it's never stopped since day one. And it's important to recognize that these assaults today, they're systemic, using government forces to do that. Historically, they've been primarily violent assaults to move people off of land. Violent assaults where people were assaulted and killed, murdered, raped, brutalized to move them off the land. And, this is what this country's history is about. That's all it's about. It's really about nothing else except that. And I don't care how many times people try to remake it or reclassify it or make it something else. What I just said, that's the history of this nation. So, of course, when the violence didn't work, and got to a certain point, if you study the period of the 1950s, for example, what you'll find in relationship to this violent assault against indigenous people, against African people, and with African people, it was primarily manifested through racist terror, lynchings, burning people out of their houses, rape, murder, all of these things. What began to happen is as international media technology began to pick up, and the 1950s is relevant because that's when the majority of people begin to have access to televisions in their houses, in their residences. And what this did is it made it a lot more difficult to carry out these reigns of open terror, which have been day-to-day policy in this society. Because now you had international television, and it began to really create problems for, especially after World War II, where the US was working so hard to project itself as the world citadel of freedom and democracy, and yet you're terrorizing these indigenous people, these African people. So this is when the federal government during this period began to put a lot of pressure on locales to stop this overt physical terror and to rely more on the systemic bureaucratic terror that they could use to oppress people. But that doesn't make it any better. It just was a different tactic that was utilized. But it's important to note that going back to, you can go back to 1863, this Homestead Act, strongly encourage you to look it up if you are not aware of it. What the Homestead Act did, it was passed by your favorite president, Abraham Lincoln. And, he keep trying to tell us since I was a little boy that he was a friend to the African person. And even as a little boy, I knew that was a lie. And now that I've been able to study it, consistently, there's no question that it was a lie. Every U.S. president, all 45 of them have been terrorists and supporters of white supremacy. Even the dark one, terrorists and supporters of white supremacy. Not one of them has been any different. And they've all carried out an agenda of terrorism and white supremacy. And old Honest Abe was no different. So Honest Abe passed the Homestead Act in 1863. And that Homestead Act, what it did is it allowed for the forced removal of indigenous people from their lands and for European people to apply to have a stake in those territories, in those properties. Now, the land said that freed Africans who were freed from slavery could do that, but 99.9% of the time, we were not permitted to do it. So we couldn't do it. And Asians couldn't do it, and no one else could do it. So we're talking about white people who got this land. It's important to note that about 10% of all the lands in this country were redistributed to white people through this Homestead Act. And then on top of that, you have to realize that all 50 of these emerging states, as they've developed, have had at one point in time in their history, some version of the Homestead Act. So if you add all of that together, you're talking about close to half of this country. Land has been placed in the hands of white people that was systemically stolen from indigenous people. At least half. That just happened outright, where people just got the land through, out and out, just overt theft. And then the other portion was, achieved through underlining theft, like what I talked about with the gentrification process. So that, that's this belief that we've all been given that, people that own all these properties, they worked harder and they were smarter and they did all that. Like there's no historical foundation for that belief. The people who have wealth in this country have it through theft and murder, period, dot. Irrefutable history on that. So, today, because of these processes that have taken place, theft of indigenous land it's just normalized. It's just people will tell you like, well, I had this European the other day tell me, because I had on a shirt and it had a big picture of Dennis Banks on it, who's the not long ago departed co-founder of the American Indian Movement. And it's a picture of him walking around one of the times when he was in prison. And, in this backward society, if you're African, you're not supposed to wear, I guess, a picture of an indigenous person. It doesn't make sense to people because of their limited mind frame. So this guy approaches me, this European guy approaches me. He's like, it says right on it, Dennis Banks. So he says to me, well, who is that? And I just looked at him because I don't go around with these people on this. I don't play these. I'm not going to play these games with people. So I just looked at him and I said, did you have trouble with reading in school? Or, it says right there who it is, and if you don't believe I talk to people like that, you just talk to anybody that knows me, they'll tell you. So he's like, well, I just, who is the guy? And I'm like, well, he's an indigenous person who fought for justice in this society. I said, you don't know anything about anybody because all the people you learned about were thieves and murderers, but this is an actual person that worked for justice for humanity, and so he was saying, well, I don't think most of these lands were stolen. So that's what I mean when I say most of these people have no clue about the history of this land. And then this guy, they're arrogant about it too. They're arrogant in their ignorance. So he says to me, and if they lost, they just need to accept that they lost. And so, I understand this psychology, and I understand how people think in this society. So when he said that to me, and I said this to a number of people, I said, so your logic is that if I just jump on you right now and beat you down to the ground, and take everything you got, then, hey, I got a right to it. Is that what you're telling me? Because I need to know if that's what you believe. I need to understand it. I'm going to get my phone out and I'm going to record you telling me this. And then that's all I said. And he, whoa, I'm not really saying, I'm like, no, that is what you said. So, it's a contradiction, but it's something that we have to be aware of so we can struggle against it. I'm not just talking about struggling against idiots like that. I'm just talking about so we can understand what this contradiction is and how it works. because it has become a normalized process where this land just belongs to whoever's here. You know, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, which you call South Africa, one of our sister party organizations, you know, they have a saying, and they talk about, you know, because the Azania was a settler colony where Europeans are there, right? They're still there to this day. And so, you know, one of the things the PAC has said for years, the founder of the PAC, Mangaliso Sobukwe, what he used to say is France belongs to the French, Germany belongs to the Germans, but Africa belongs to whomever is there. No, Africa belongs to the Africans. Well, the Americas belong to the indigenous people. So what we have to do is begin to challenge this on every level that you see it, you all, whether it's songs that are being sang, whether anytime people start talking about our country, our streets, whose streets are, you got to challenge that stuff. We got to begin to change the culture around that. You know, this is not your country. Just because you're here, it's not yours. And so we have to really begin to organize a campaign to do that. And the reason why we got to do that is because, you know, we all know justice it has to be universal. It can't just mean one thing over here, but over there it means something else. It has to be universal. It has to apply to every situation. If it's right, it has to be right every time, everywhere, right? And so if we believe that, because some of us don't believe it. Some of us believe what truth is one thing today and then it's something totally different tomorrow. Well, I don't believe that. I believe truth is universal. It travels across time. It travels across land. It travels across generations. It travels. And I believe that if you stole something 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years later, you're still a thief if you have not returned what you stole. And that's universally true. Like 1 + 1 = 2. Even though in this society today, people try to like, well, your truth is your truth. That's bourgeois nonsense. So if my truth is my truth, then if I believe 1 + 1 = 75, then that's right, because that's my truth. Clearly that makes absolutely no sense. But you all have heard this, you've heard this kind of bourgeois nonsense. And the reason why it's being promoted is because this is the foundation needed to justify these injustices that have happened. So if I can say, well, my truth is my truth, then I can say, well, this land wasn't really stolen, because that's my truth. I don't believe it was stolen. I believe the people who have it because they worked harder, they were better blessed by God, and they all this other nonsense. I can believe that, so that makes it true. So what we're saying is, no, there's a universal truth. And even the white man I just described to you, he knew that, because when I made it personal and he thought in his mind that I was going to jump on him, then now all of a sudden he's totally in line with the principles of justice. Oh, it's wrong. You know, so people know better. So we have to force people to be accountable to that. And part of that, you all, is we've got to challenge this concept of being an American. And I know many of you listening right now, you perpetuate this contradiction. I'm an American. Well, what our government does, well, we invaded Iraq. You didn't get nobody called you and asked you whether the U.S. should invade Iraq. Nobody asked for your opinion on that. And even if you would have flown or driven or walked to Washington, D.C. and demanded that they hear your opinion, they weren't going to listen to you because your opinion doesn't matter. So I don't know why we think that these are things that represent us. I don't know what kind of person could believe that. Like, clearly this is an agenda of people who you have no access to, who are not the least bit concerned about you. So we really just have to stop with this nonsense. And I get it. I understand why we do it. We do it because for a number of reasons. And I'll talk about it from the context of just different communities. For African people, the reason why we do it, the reason why we claim American identity is because the system has frozen us out of any knowledge of Africa. I guarantee you, you bring 10 Africans living in the US, and I say living because they could be born in Africa. The Africans born in Africa don't know anything about African history because colonial history is taught worldwide, you all. I've been in schools throughout Africa. We have schools throughout Africa. And you go to schools in Africa, and most of the books that are there and studied are books donated by evangelical Christians. And so that should be all I need to tell you to let you know how backward that educational information is going to be. So you go there and you see Huck Finn is what the students in Africa are studying. So it doesn't matter where people are born, y'all. It's a worldwide system of exploitation. So that's how it works, right? So we don't have that clear understanding of African history. So because we don't have that, we believe that we want to relate to the winner. And the way history has been taught to us, the winner is imperialism. The winner is US capitalism. So we think there's something good here because that's what we've been taught, and we haven't studied anything that would challenge that. So we want to be connected to it. We want to do whatever we can to be connected to it. So that's why we claim identity. And really, that's the reason everybody else claims it. Even other communities that have large percentages of people who immigrated to this country in recent years, what's that all about? They have been propagandized to believe that this is the land of milk and honey, this is the land of opportunity, and they don't know anything about whatever opportunity they have, it's on the backs of indigenous and African people, and even some poor white people. They don't understand any of that. None of that. In fact, most of these folks that come here, they don't even understand that the country they're praising didn't even want them to come here. And it was the African civil rights movement that pushed immigration legislation through the 1965 Immigration Reform Act that made it even possible for them to come here. But they credit US imperialism for that, the very entity that never wanted them here and still doesn't want them here. So that's, again, misinformation. So that's why people claim American identity. And I think what we have to do is correct that with correct education. So we have to challenge that, right? There can be no difference between American identity and white supremacy. Because when you call yourself an American, whether you mean it or not, whether you know it or not, what you're doing is you're claiming responsibility for the theft of indigenous land, for the enslavement and subjugation of African people. You're claiming to have that. And I don't care how much work you put into trying to reform that. Well, we want to make this country live up to its ideals. It's doing that. It's been doing that for 528 years. It was founded on terrorism, and it still continues based on terrorism. So it's doing that. Your work is done in that regard. If your objective is to make this country live up to its ideals, you can go ahead and find something else to do because it is very good at living up to its ideals. So you cannot call yourselves an American, you all. We've got to stop doing that. And then the question always comes up, well, what do I call myself? Well, what do you believe in? Because identity, what is identity? Identity is an expression of your interests. Identity is not where you come from. That's some backward bourgeois logic. Like a cat in your house, if you have a cat, or if you look outside and see a cat or a squirrel or a crow or pigeon or whatever you're able to see of a living being, a roach, a spider, whatever it is, when you see that entity, you don't know where it came from. You can't look at it and say, oh, well, it comes from Kansas City, Missouri, US. You don't know where it came from. You don't know where the animal came from. So the concept that defining who someone is based on where they come from is absurd. The way you know what something is based on what it does. And entities do something based on what's in their interest. So a cat has specific interests to feed itself. A crow has specific interests to feed itself and survive. A squirrel, same thing. So based on how they carry out their day-to-day life, even if you couldn't really see them clearly, you can figure out what they are based on what they do. That's identity, you all. We got to release this backward bourgeois concept of what they've taught us identity. The reason why they want you to believe that is because that way they can keep us confused about what our real interests are. For example, as long as the majority of African people believe their identity is based on where they're born, and you were born in the United Snakes of America, so that's all you got to pay attention to, Long as they can keep us convinced of that, we will never look to Africa. We will never understand that we should never be satisfied to wear a diamond ring when the diamonds come from Africa like we do. We should be controlling the entire world diamond industry. We will never think like that. We will, oh, I got me a diamond ring at Jared or whatever jeweler. I don't know any of those. I don't have jewelry, so I don't know who it is. Sam's Jewel, whoever it is. We'll just be happy with that. We'll just be happy to have the Mercedes-Benz instead of thinking the steel, the zinc, the oil, all of these things that make up this car, the rubber, come from Africa. So why are we not controlling automobile production? We won't even think like that. We'll just, well, I got me a Mercedes-Benz, and I'm making a payment to the very same bank that started from enslaving us. And I couldn't be happier to be able to be in a position to be that kind of slave in 2020 and beyond. That's the only way we can think. So that's why, you know, that limited perspective of identity is imposed upon us. We got to think broader than that. Identity is what defines your interests. And a lot of that is determined by class, right? And other variables. But if we understand that, then the way you define yourself is just based on what your interests are. So what are your interests? That's what you got to, if you want to know how to define yourself, if you don't use American, then you got to ask yourself, what are you living to accomplish? And once you can answer that question, that's your identity. For me, that question was resolved decades ago. I'm an African currently living in the United States of America, fighting to overthrow international capitalism and imperialism. That's my identity. That's who I am. No question about that, no confusion. I don't have to, you know, it's clear who I am. And I know it's clear because when I define myself to you, when I meet you, your response is always the same. Oh, okay. Like there's no follow-up questions, everything, that's clear. Okay, so if you define your own identity, it should be clear. I'm a German working against international capitalism and imperialism. What is wrong with that? That's a beautiful definition. That's a beautiful identity. I'm an Italian working against this. I'm an indigenous person fighting for my land back. That's your identity. You don't even use these terms that have American in them, because all that does is confuse where we need to go. It really does. American identity cannot be separated from white supremacy because America as an identity is based on white supremacy. You can't redefine it. I mean, for these people that you believe that you can redefine it, like people who say you can use the N-word in a positive sense. And my response to that, and I've had this conversation probably millions of times, no exaggeration, and I always tell people the same thing, and no one has had a logical answer yet. So I asked them, so if your argument is that the N-word can be used in a positive sense, where is your evidence of that? Where is us using the N-word to define each other helped us as a people? Nobody can answer because there's nowhere that it's helped us. Well, it's the same with the American identity. Where have African people defining themselves as Americans helped us as a people? How has that helped us advance collectively as a people? It is not. It is not. And if anything, it's held us back because it's prevented us from understanding what our true interests are. How have Native people defining themselves as Americans, how has that helped them? It hasn't. It hasn't even helped working class white people, because all it's done is reinforce for working class white people that your interests and the interests of the capitalist system are one and the same. And so once you believe that, you will never take any action to challenge the capitalist system. Even those of you that are so-called liberals, you will only go as far as allowed to go to not challenge this system, and then you'll stop, which means you'll never change anything. So we have got to understand that principle. And the other portion of that is there's this backward movement, because again, we don't study our history. We don't know anything about Africa. And I've never met one of these people that I'm about to talk about who can have a clear and every African I've ever talked to who had a clear researched understanding of African history loved being African. The only ones who deny Africa are the ones who have no knowledge of Africa. I've never met a person, African knowledgeable about Africa who denies Africa. That's never happened. So there's this backward movement taking place right now where some of these people are claiming that they're not Africans. They have no history with slavery. I mean, I'm talking about people whose families come from the South in the US, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana. They have no connection to slavery. Okay, that's what they're telling me. Their names are Johnson, Smith, Dehort, which was my French slave name, but yet they have no connection to slavery. And then they're even telling me, well, our families had, distinct histories, da, 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 da. And, of course, the world is full of all types of innovation. So I'm sure there were some people who did, of course, come, and obviously we know trade happened before colonialism. Ivan van Sertima's groundbreaking book, They Came Before Columbus, clearly illustrates that. Africans came here and traded with indigenous people. Indigenous people went to Africa and traded. Europeans came and traded. Asians came and traded. The Olmec heads in southern Mexico were the indigenous people's monument to the Africans that they had developed relationships with. Of course, all of this happened, and we study history, so we don't need you to tell us about it. We probably know more about it than you do, so we know this. But that is not the majority of Africans in the Western Hemisphere today. That is a very small, minute percentage of us that represent direct lineage to that. The overwhelming majority of us, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we know it or not, are here because of the kidnapping of our ancestors and our repopulation efforts here once we arrived in the Western Hemisphere. That's the reason the majority of us are here. And I understand why people don't want to admit that, because again, they don't know anything about Africa. All they know about Africa is what their enemies have told them. So for them, why would they claim that? All I ever learned about Africa when I was growing up was that people there are starving, people fight war, they can't get along. That's the only thing I heard. And for a lot of you listening, that's what you understand about Africa today. You don't know much of anything about Africa beyond what imperialism has taught you about Africa. So this is why people feel like they have to make up history and say, well, we're indigenous people, or we're the real indigenous people, and the actual indigenous people are not actually indigenous people, all this other kind of nonsense. And if you ever encounter someone like that, all you got to do is ask them, so tell me what books you've read about African history. They're not going to be able to tell you any because they don't know any. They haven't done that. And they're operating off of shame. That's what they're doing. Bring any of them to me and I can demonstrate that they're operating off of shame, because I'm a proud African who studies my history constantly. And I would not want to be anybody. I love all of humanity, because once you learn a respect for yourself, you learn a respect for all other humanity. So I love all of humanity, but I would never want to be anything other than an African. I love being an African. So we got to stop that nonsense right now. It's disrespectful to our ancestors. It's disrespectful to our history. And it's antithesis to our movement, which will require us to connect with Africa for our own freedom and liberation. And it's also disrespectful to the indigenous people. And then, again, for everybody, any effort to connect yourself with American identity on any level, whether you mean to do it or not, you're automatically advancing settler colonialism when you do this, because you're normalizing the theft, because you're an American, which means it's your land. And so that negates whose land it really is. So even if all you do is just say that, I'm an American, it's an American right, it's our Constitution, it's our government, it's our military. Even if you say something like that, you are doing nothing except advancing the backwardness of settler colonialism. And I'm reading this book right now that just came out. I'm going to write a review about it, so I'm not going to talk about the book. But it's a biography on Malcolm X. Malcolm X is my ideological father. So anytime anything comes out on Malcolm, I read it immediately and analyze it, because there are a lot of hit pieces going on against our warriors for justice. And so I will say this book hasn't necessarily been a hit piece, although it's, there's some huge disappointments. But one of the things that he talks about is a May 1964 speech Malcolm gave in New York City. And again, this was after several months after he had left the Nation of Islam and was embarking and being able to express his revolutionary Pan-African aspirations, which he was growing into the last 11 months of his life after he had left the nation. And in that speech in New York in May of 1964, Malcolm says, it's impossible for a white person to believe in capitalism and not believe in racism. You can't have capitalism without racism. If you meet a non-racist white, usually they're socialists. So I think that that's, kind of the essence of what we're saying, in the sense that if you in any way identify yourself as an American, you're negating what we just said, what we just quoted from Malcolm. What you're doing is you're advancing the settler colonial regime. No matter what your intention, that's what you're doing, because you're normalizing that this is your land, which means if it's your land, it can't be the indigenous people's land. And so you're doing that. And so that's something that, we have to stop doing. And so, some concrete steps we can take. Again, obviously, a large part of the reason why this is so easily able to happen, this misinformation, is because we don't have enough people who have enough information to challenge it and fight back against it. So how do you do that? You have to be engaged in organized study processes so you can understand something about this society before 1492, something about this hemisphere. You're living on it. You should know something about it. Something about it before 1492. So the best way to do that is to unite, link up with people who want to learn, no matter who you are, and develop a study apparatus so that you can get a clear understanding of what this settler colony is all about, how it came to exist, what its principles are, what its values are, how it maintains itself, how it exploits and oppresses the indigenous people to maintain all of that. You got to get a clear understanding of that, because I organize in all types of circles, y'all. Obviously, I organize in the African community through my Pan-African work. I also organize with, in coalition groups with white so-called progressives, socialists, anarchists, whatever they want to call themselves. I organize in labor circles. I work for a labor union. So, I am very attuned. Like when people start talking, when they don't talk about these concepts, when they don't talk about the U.S. being a settler colony, I'm not trying to hear nothing else they got to say. I tell them, like, I'm not with your analysis, because you basically say, I don't care how leftist you consider yourself, if you're not at the forefront of your analysis talking about the theft of indigenous land and the enslavement of Africans and the fact capitalism was built on all of those, then you ain't talking to me. I ain't trying to hear nothing you're talking about. And if you're talking about, well, we're going to have some sort of movement to overthrow this system, and you're not talking about those issues, then there is no way that we're going to trust anything that you're saying or doing. You're no different than the ones in power right now. And we don't trust you any more than we trust them. So that analysis has to be front and foremost for you. An anti-settler analysis, an anti-colonial analysis. And so you get that through organizing an organized political education process that can make sure you develop that. And then in the process of that, you got to help build principled relationships with indigenous people who are fighting for their land back. The Mi'kmaq people in Canada I mentioned earlier, land reclamation in Zimbabwe and Tanzania, what you call South Africa. Of course, occupied Palestine. You have to form relationships with those communities, the African communities, the Palestinian communities, the indigenous communities. Across all those communities, people serious about justice have to form these relationships with these communities and be studying what these communities are doing. I always come across these young white activists. They mean well. They mean so well. And they're always talking about, I stand for Black Lives Matter. And then when I have a conversation about, they know nothing about the African liberation movement, nothing about our history, nothing. And I'm like, you can never convince me that you are really seriously standing up for something you don't know anything about. You only do it to an extent, and then you'll go to something else. We see that this movie is out now, the Chicago 7 about the trial as a result of the protests at the 1968 Democratic Party convention in Chicago. And, you know, the key people in there, Bobby Seale, who was, of course, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin. And they talk about, you know, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, Tom Hayden, they were some of the, you know, most militant white radicals of the 60s. And then, you know, Jerry Rubin invested in Apple and became a millionaire before he was killed in 1994, but he became a millionaire. So he, you know, by the time right before he was killed, he was arguing that the solution to systemic inequity was capital. It was capital. So, you know, this is why political education is so important. You got to study and understand these movements so you can understand why you support them. Because as you get older in the capitalist system, the pressure mounts for you to be at a certain place based on capitalist standards. And I don't care how radical you are, if you don't have a process that's designed to help you navigate through that in a healthy, psychological and spiritual way, you're going to end up just like Jerry Rubin. And Abby Hoffman, unfortunately, he took his own life. So, you know, we don't want you to do that. We want you to be around to contribute to this struggle. And so we got to learn about these movements, you know, because otherwise in time, imperialism will break you down. If you don't know what you're talking about, it will break you down. It'll get you thinking about, I'm 40 years old and I don't have a house yet. I have failed relationships. I don't have, my kids don't treat me the way I want them to treat me. I got to change my life. I got to get out of this movement stuff and I got to get back to church. That's what's going to, I mean, you'll be thinking some kind of stuff like that. Like none of those things is going to change unless you know, have a clear understanding of what your purpose in life is. And I think that, you know, doing this work and having a ideological foundation to guide the work is the absolute best way to do that. And then, you know, when we say principal relationships, we don't just mean liberal talk, you know, where you say everything that needs to be said up until the point that it makes you uncomfortable. That we don't need, with friends like that, we don't need enemies. You know, we want people who are going to take themselves out of their comfort zone in the name of justice. That's what we need. So that means understanding militant movements, because as Malcolm said, extreme conditions require extreme solutions. So if you're really down for justice, you got to be understanding of that, and you got to develop an understanding of those movements and move to support them and to build support for them, and understanding how to do that, how to build that support, and supporting national liberation everywhere. We need more people supporting national liberation. We need more Africans supporting the national liberation of indigenous people. We need more indigenous people and Europeans understanding that Africa is the solution for Africans everywhere. We need more Africans understanding that Palestine must be free. We need more Europeans understanding that the indigenous, these lands and the indigenous lands, we got to cross-fertilize this stuff. And that's how we build the kind of movement that will win. The reason why we're struggling so hard now is that we're so weak in all these areas I'm talking about. And so basically what we end up doing, you see it all the time. I can't tell you how many young organizers I've seen who they're militant, they're not studying anything. And after a couple of years, they get offered a job. And now they're 5 years later, they're all ingrained in the system. Well, once that happens, they're not going to be seeking any true justice. They're just going to be, you know, trying to do just enough to keep people off their backs and to keep their job, keep those paychecks coming in. So these are important things we need to do. And obviously we don't do that unless we're in organizations, as we always say. Got to have people in organizations working for justice with political education programs and community defense projects that they're working on. And if you want more information about all of these things, if you want to join the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and you should join the APRP, then go to aprp-intl.org. But we are a serious organization. So if all you're interested in doing is being sometime even, don't waste our time, please. Betterworld.me is my site if you want to contact about how to develop ideas. If you have, for example, you have a political education, you want to implement it, but you don't know how. Well, we have a template. We're happy to share it with you and walk you through how to institutionalize it in your organization. And then the hoodcommunist.org site is a wonderful site of African revolutionaries. I post on there quite often as well. Just had one on there this week about this whole Platinum Plan, Ice Cube confusion. And that brings us to the topic next week, which we have already decided, Shakur and I, is going to be peeling the covers off of the Black bourgeoisie. Peeling the covers off of the Black bourgeoisie. So please look for that. And we sincerely thank you for joining us today. Shakur, anything you want to say before we go?
I just wanted to note that Glenn asked, what was the name of the writer? Again, the book is called They Came Here Before. He was hoping someone could
Ivan Van Sertima. They came before Columbus.
Awesome.
Ivan Van Sertima. Sertima. Yes. So yes. Thank you all. Appreciate you all. Come back next week, pulling the covers off of the Black bourgeoisie. And we hope you have a wonderful week. We appreciate each and every one of you. Reach out if you have questions or anything. Be safe, be practical, get organized. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Forward ever, backwards never.